Hello and welcome to this discussion on gender pay gap reporting. My name's Mark Tarrant. I'm a member of the employment team at Practical Law.
My name's Jenny Barnes. I'm one of the lawyers on the employment team at Mishcon de Reya.
And I'm Will Winch, also at Mishcon de Reya in the employment team.
So after more than 40 years of equal pay and sex discrimination legislation in Great Britain, we are still left with a significant gap between the earnings of women and men. The extent to which this is down to discrimination or barriers which create difficulties for women with childcare responsibilities in the workplace or other factors such as personal choice is still a matter for some speculation and controversy. But the government has pledged to reduce the gender pay gap, and this is where we are today with the legislation that we're considering. So the Equality Act Gender Pay Gap Information Regulations, more commonly known as the Gender Pay Gap Regulations, came into force on the 6th of April 2017, and they create a duty on larger private sector and voluntary sector employers to publish annual reports on the gender pay gap within their organisation. There are also similar duties on some public sector organisations under the Equality Act specific duties and public authorities regulations. We're going to be considering the aims of this legislation and looking at which organisations it covers, what employees are included, and also looking at the type of data that's going to need to be published in the reports. We're also going to be considering some of the difficulties inherent in the legislation, as well as whether or not it's likely to achieve its aims. So, to start at the beginning, Jenny, can you explain what the gender pay gap is?
Sure. So as you mentioned in your introduction, Mark, on average in this country, men are paid more than women. The most recent statistics released by the Office of National Statistics for 2016 indicated an 18.1% gender pay gap, which means that for every pound that a man earns, a woman earns on average, when looking at hourly pay, around 82 pence.
Okay, and where are we most likely to find a larger gender pay gap?
Well, it's interesting you use the word gender pay gap there, because in fact the largest pay gap is actually between the average hourly rates connected to part-time employees and full-time employees or workers. And actually, if you look at the statistics, full-time employees and the average difference between the way the genders are paid is much closer than when you look at the combined statistics of both part-time and full-time workers as a whole. And similarly, when you look at the disparity between the way that men and women are paid insofar as that they are both part-time workers, again, there actually women are doing marginally better than men on average. And so one of the most significant pay gaps is between the rate that part-time workers are paid at and the rate that full-time workers are paid at. And for whatever reasons, women are more likely than men to take up part-time work and flexible work. The other area where we see significant gender pay gaps is actually throughout the generations, and particularly for women over the age of 30 through into their 40s, and that lasts throughout their career. In fact, women in their 20s are not doing bad at all on average compared to men.
The precise causes of the gender pay gap are a matter for some speculation and can be hard to pin down within an organisation. But what are some of the main contributing factors?
Yeah, well, the main one, and it's potentially a fairly obvious one, is the fact that women are often more likely than men to take a career break connected to having children, and that's where you see the disparity starting to arise in 30s and 40s, which are typically the decades that women will be giving more of their time to childcare. And in fact, the Office of National Statistics has released a report again recently showing that women still bear approximately 74% of the childcare burden. And so, in essence, women seem to be spending more time looking after children and are therefore the section in our society that are more likely to want to do part-time and flexible working, which for whatever reason, are less well paid than their full-time equivalents within an organisation. And whether that's down to rigid corporate structures and traditional ways of thinking, it's hard to say. but that's one of the principal reasons. Additionally, discrimination, whether conscious or unconscious bias, the choice of women, that they all could play a part as well.
Mm-hmm. So, Will, how are these new regulations supposed to help? How do they differ from the legislation that we've already got on equal pay and sex discrimination?
Well, they're not a piece of legislation that is designed to apportion liability. In fact, there's question marks as to whether there's any penalties at all that are going to be faced by employers who fail to comply with the obligations under the regulations. The idea is more that they're designed to encourage transparency. And so the idea that employers are being saddled with too much red tape is obviously something that the government is not wanting to get involved in. But at the same time, they recognise that there is this pressure to address the gender pay gap. So rather than being too prescriptive as to what employers should do, they're allowing the market essentially to regulate the relationship between employers and their employees by asking employers to be more transparent about the way that their employees' pay is being addressed. This means that there's not the focus in the legislation about any particular compensation that's going to be available to anyone. It's simply there to try and ask employers to be as transparent as possible.
So it's essentially saying, let's put the information out there and employers can decide what, if anything, they want to do about any problems that are revealed.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, so let's look now at the actual legislation itself, and we'll start by looking at which employers are actually going to be covered by this new duty.
So large employers in the private sector are covered. That's employers who employ more than 250 or more employees. Now, employees for these purposes are quite a widely defined group. So it's the definition that's used in the Equality Act of employees that's relevant for these purposes. So that means that it's workers who are employed either under a contract of employment or a contract for services where they're providing the services personally. This will therefore include employees in the traditional sense, workers including part-time workers, fixed-term workers, etc. But zero-hours contractors, casual workers will be caught as well. But also the wider sense of in one sense, LLP members, although there's a slightly tricky bit about that, but LLP members will be caught in relation to whether an employer employs 250 or more. So whether it falls within scope, although the LLP members will be taken out of the equation for the calculations. But also consultants as well, the people who are providing their services personally as consultants will be captured in that definition of whether 250 people are being employed. And remember, it's 250 people rather than 250 full-time equivalent roles. So even if you've got 10 people doing 0.1 of a role, you've got 10 people. You haven't got just one role at that point.
So what about agency workers? Are they going to be covered?
Agency workers won't be covered for the end users' calculations, but they may well be covered when you're counting up the recruitment business's number of employees, which is going to cause some quite difficult problems for recruitment businesses, I think, generally. But essentially, no, if they're not engaged by the end user client, they'll count towards the recruitment business's figures rather than the client's.
And there are a lot of international businesses with employees who may be posted overseas or working permanently overseas. How are we going to deal with those under the regulations?
It's going to be quite difficult to tell, to be honest. In the 2016 draft regulations, it was made fairly clear that it was employees in Great Britain. That phrase got taken out, so it's not entirely clear what the situation is. I think that probably, given the way that case law runs otherwise, is that the tests that are set out for determining whether someone has the close connection with Great Britain will probably apply here as well. So the Lawson and Serco tests. Now, it's difficult to say that with any complete certainty. Also, possibly, it may well be that some of these minutiae may not actually matter too much, because it's only going to really affect those employers who, within maybe 10 of the 250, may have some people out of scope because they're overseas. But otherwise, as long as people have got 250 or more in this country, then it's pretty clear that they're going to be caught.
So probably more of an important issue is what happens with group companies. Do they amalgamate all of their employees, or do you take each entity separately?
The good news for a lot of group companies, in some ways, is that you treat each company separately. Now, that may mean that you could have an example where you've got a group with 10 companies, each of those companies employing 249 people. And although they employ as a group nearly 2,500 people, they won't actually come within scope of the reporting regulations at all. Now, ACAS suggests that people who are around the 250 should probably think about reporting in any event, but in that specific example, there will be no actual requirement for them to do so. Now, the flip of that, of course, is that group companies will therefore have to make quite a lot of separate reports for each of their group companies, which may or may not be a good thing for them, because they might be able to compartmentalise some of the bad news into one of their group companies and have other group companies with very good gender pay reporting figures. Mm-hmm. The issue, I think, is going to be whether they want to start cross-referring to those group companies, and one of the key things, I think, in all of this stuff is going to be the extent to which the narrative, the ability to put a narrative into the figures, is going to be of massive use, I think, in those situations where a group company can say, well, okay, we may be a bit adrift on this company, but look at the rest of the group. And they may be able to explain away some of their problems by looking across the group. Okay, well, we'll come on to talk a bit about the narrative later, but first, Jenny, let's talk about some of the data that actually needs to be provided in the reports. Mm-hmm. And there are 6 different figures that need to be provided, aren't there? Can you give us a run through of what those figures are?
Yeah, absolutely. And there are 6 different figures, and I find it useful to compartmentalise them into 2 sections, because you have 3 figures that relate to a calculation that's connected to an hourly average rate of pay, and you have 3 sets of figures that are relating to bonus data that looks back over a year's period. The 3 kind of data points arising from the hourly pay are: an employer must show the mean difference between male and female average hourly pay. It must show the median difference between male and female hourly pay. When I was quoting the 18.1% earlier, that was actually the median average. And also, in a slightly different way, an employer, once they've worked out their hourly rates of pay for each employee, effectively the regulations require the employer to stack up their employees in order, depending on their hourly rate of pay, and split them into 4 equal sections, with each section having an equal number of employees, and then report within each section the proportion of men and women. And that's, of course, to give an indication of how the gender balance is looking across the different levels of pay within an organisation. So then you have your 3 statistics that connect to the bonus data, and the bonus data is looking back over a year period. You have the mean and median average figures, which are equivalent to the hourly pay figures, showing the mean difference in bonus between men and women on average and median.
So this is looking at the total bonus received during the course of the past year, is that right?
Exactly, and when we say the past year, we're looking at the year going back from the 5th of April in each year, the snapshot dates. And then the final statistic or data point connected with bonus is an employer needs to just show simply the proportion of men that received a bonus and the proportion of women that received a bonus within their organisation.
Okay, so going back to basics on the actual data, which employees need to be covered? Is it all employees that need to be covered? The legislation talks about the concept of a relevant full pay employee. What's that concept all about?
So yeah, relevant full pay employee, that is the type of employee that the regulations prescribe an employer needs to look at for calculating the data I've just spoken about connected to hourly pay. This effectively removes those employees who are on the payroll but receiving nil or a reduced rate of pay as a result of being on leave. And typically that kind of leave is going to be maternity leave or long-term sick leave. The reason that these employees were excluded from the hourly rate of pay is because during the consultation there was a lot of concern, I guess particularly with maternity leave, that it would unfairly skew the figures for employers.
So it would make women's average pay look lower than it really is.
Exactly, yeah. Yeah, and then Will referenced it very quickly earlier, but another important exclusion from the pay data is the pay data connected to members, LLP members and partners. And effectively the government decided that that section of employee or worker effectively are paid in such a different way, because it's usually connected to profit share and what have you, that they weren't to be included in the figures.
So they're taken entirely out of the picture.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, and when we're talking about the pay gap figures, what sort of period of pay are we actually talking about that has to be included in the reports?
So if we look at the two sections of data, first of all, we have the data connected to this hourly rate of pay. Here, the regulations compel employers to look at the relevant pay periods, and that depends on the pay period that the employer operates, but it will be the pay period in which the 5th of April of each year is included. So to give a typical example, if an employee is paid on a monthly basis, the employer will be looking at the payroll for April. In relation to the bonus, you're looking at the year gone by, ending on the 5th of April.
Do you include any element of bonus in the actual calculation of pay?
Good question, and the answer is yes. But there's a complicating factor in that as part of the calculation for hourly pay, if an employer so happens to pay their bonuses in April, you do use the bonus pay, but you prorate it effectively, so it doesn't entirely distort the figures for the year.
So if it's an annual bonus, you would just take a 12th of that bonus.
Exactly.
And call that part of the pay for April.
Exactly.
So how do they actually calculate the hourly rate of pay? There's a complex series of steps in the regulations for working out what hourly pay is, isn't there? There
is. It's set over 2 of the regulations, and it's quite a formulaic, quite wordy process through these stages. But in essence, what an employer needs to do for to calculate hourly pay is they need to look at the pay that's referable to the relevant pay period, i.e. discount anything that's back pay or forward pay. They need to work out if there's been any bonus paid, and if there has, they need to prorate that down. They add all that together. You throw in a multiplier, which effectively brings all that down to be equivalent to a week's pay, and then you divide that notional week's pay by working hours in the week for each employee. And then hopefully you spit out your hourly rate of pay per employee.
Yeah, and there are certain things that are not included in that rate of pay. So, for example, overtime, pension contributions, how are those treated under the regulations?
The regulations are actually, in some ways, quite prescriptive about what's in and what's out. In is basic pay, as you would imagine. Allowances, like a car allowance. Pay for piecework, if that's relevant, and also shift premium pay, i.e. that's the pay that somebody might get if they were working shifts at antisocial hours, and it's the top up to compensate for that. And pay for holiday. Expressly excluded is overtime pay and anything referable to overtime. Remuneration paid otherwise than in money. Things like childcare, mainly people are understanding that to be benefits that are provided by way of salary sacrifice schemes. Termination payments and payments in lieu of leave.
So what's this data actually going to tell us?
Well, the government hopes that it's going to give a good indication of the practices and gender pay imbalance within any organisation, and it's hoping that this transparency is going to compel employers to action. But in essence, it potentially isn't going to tell us some very important pieces of information. I discussed earlier the problems or the issues that we're facing in relation to the levels of pay for part-time work and full-time work, and that's obviously not going to feature in these gender pay statistics because that's not factored
There's no
into the
data on
calculation.
part-timers versus full-timers
Exactly.
in the figures.
It's also pretty much not going to tell us much about the generational divide that I spoke about earlier either, although the quartiles does help to some degree with looking at the layers of seniority, which often does, naturally correlate with age, but still, that's missing. And then another really important thing that is missing, actually, especially in terms of trying to understand why there is this imbalance, is it's not showing attrition rates and women that leave the organisation entirely, potentially as a result of having children or extra demands on their time.
So the guidance produced by the government and ACAS is encouraging employers to include what they call narrative information, which is information they're not obliged to provide, but is over and above the sort of data that they have to provide under the regulations. What's the purpose of this narrative information, and how does it help?
Well, it really is to give employers a tool to explain themselves, I think. I think a lot of employers are naturally going to have a gender pay gap because a lot of employers will follow the national trends, and this gives an employer to explain why. For instance, a technology company is highly likely to be saying that we would love to recruit more females, but over the past 10, 20 years, the pool of female graduates that has undertaken the relevant degrees in science and maths is far fewer than men, and so that's caused a disparity within our organisation. So it gives employers the opportunity to explain themselves. It also gives employers the opportunity to and the government encourages them to explain what plans are being put in place to help address gender pay disparities. And I think these are the principal purposes. And also, if an employer feels that as a result of certain calculations and the certain way in which it organises its staff or its rates of pay, there's a discrepancy that actually doesn't reflect the practical reality of the pay within the organisation, they can explain that, potentially even provide alternative figures within a narrative showing that actually potentially they don't have equal pay issues.
So we'll just have to wait and see what narrative information employers come up with, because it's essentially
it's a bit of a free-for-all.
It's a bit of a free-for-all, yeah. So, Will, coming back to you, is this all as straightforward as it seems? I mean, it might not seem very straightforward, but are there any ambiguities in the legislation as to what employers actually have to do to comply?
I fear that there are. We've already touched on one in relation to the foreign service workers, but also I think the whole approach to atypical workers, so 0 hours contractors, for instance, is not clear under the legislation, I think. While yes, they are probably covered, what do you do, for instance, if you have a 0 hours contractor who isn't working on the week that the pay period falls? And it's hard to know quite what to do about them. I think you can take at least one of 4 approaches. One is to say, well, they're on leave, and therefore they fall outside the legislation completely through that particular exemption. I'm not sure quite that works, because the concept of a 0 hours worker doesn't really allow for leave to be included in that sort of approach.
It's not what we generally understand by the word leave, is it?
Exactly. So that's one way of looking at it. You could say, well, they're on 0 hours, they have made no money that week, so we divide 0 by 0, but I think that gives you infinity, so I'm not sure that's the right way of doing things. You could simply take the hourly rate that's put down in the contract. ACAS suggests that that's what you should do in certain circumstances where you've got difficulties in trying to work out what someone's rate of pay is. I'm not sure quite that really addresses it as well, because if you have a 0 hours contractor who happens to be paid a very high hourly rate, but has in fact done no work at all during the course of the year, then that might be quite a useful thing for employers to put in place put in a few women with very high hourly rates, but then never ask them to do any work. That could really skew the figures in that sense. They could also potentially, and something that ACAS again hints at on a slightly different approach, they could say, well, actually let's let's take a longer pay reference period than perhaps that you're taking for everyone else. So maybe take it annually. And you see, well, actually over the course of the year, they've done this many hours and they've been paid this much. And so that you then arrive at their hourly rate as a result of that, which has some advantages, but whether that's quite how you're supposed to do it, I'm not sure. So it's difficult to know what to do with atypical workers, which is surprising, given that 0 hours contractors, for instance, are so up in the public mind at the moment that it's not mentioned once in the ACAS guidance. It's not approached at all in the regulations, and there is this sense of, well, this works for the paradigm of a normal 9 to 5 employee working 40 hours a week. It doesn't really start addressing all of the other issues that come with part-time employees to some extent, particularly for bonuses, for instance, because bonuses don't get prorated down for things like part-time workers, for people who are on maternity leave who get a prorated bonus. While they may not count for some of the hourly rates, but if they have come back and they're in scope at the time that the hourly rate is paid, but they've had a reduced bonus because they haven't been around for as much time, then that won't be reflected in the bonus figures.
So it'll just show that she's had half the bonus that her male colleagues have had, but there's no explanation.
Yeah. So you'd have to then rely on the narrative to address that. And similarly with people who've been off on sick leave or whatever that might have got a reduced bonus as a result of that, won't necessarily be seen as that. I mean, there are issues in terms of the bonus, as you say, with the double counting. That's going to be quite difficult, I think. And it's difficult for employers to know what to do about that, because I think it's going to be very hard for an employer to change the date on which the bonus is payable, just in order to get around some problems that come with gender pay reporting. But I mean, that would be the simplest way, from the gender pay point of view, not necessarily the most popular way as far as the employees who are expecting their April bonus to come up. I think also you've got issues about people who've come across under TUPE, for instance. You may well have people who have come from other organisations with very different pay ratios, or indeed have been paid a large bonus from their previous employer that wouldn't have necessarily been what their new employer would have intended to do. But nonetheless, that's going to go into the figures and make it look as though it was the employer who's doing the reporting was responsible for what could be quite large discrepancies, and it won't be their fault, as it were. And again, they'll have to explain that through the narrative. I think another problem about bonuses comes in relation to the valuation of shares. So, for instance, if you've got a bonus that is linked to either a long-term incentive plan that relates to the performance of the company, or indeed you're being paid in shares or share options. If you're not a publicly listed company, then you could face some quite difficult problems in trying to value the business. I mean, maybe not difficult problems, but expensive problems. You're going to have to get someone to come in and value your company purely for the benefit of the gender pay reporting stuff for these individuals, which could lead you to certain difficulties further on if you have minority shareholder disputes and stuff. And if you've got a valuation that's been done on the company at a certain point, that could be used against you in relation to any other arguments that you may wish to run about the valuation of a company, as against minority shareholders shortly afterwards, for instance. Sure. So all of that's quite difficult.
And there are some separate regulations that cover public sector bodies. How do those differ from the private sector situation?
Essentially, they're pretty much the same. There are a number of small differences. One is that the snapshot date is 30th of March as opposed to the 5th of April. There's an exemption that the public sector employer won't need to give a statement of accuracy in relation to the report. They also have to give certain reports under the public sector equality duty legislation, that they have to put in some measurable targets and make it accessible and so on and so forth. But essentially, it's going to be pretty much the same as for the private sector.
It's essentially the same data, the same sort of figures.
Yeah.
So, what about enforcement, Jenny? How are these regulations going to be enforced, if at all?
It's a very good question, and essentially there are no direct enforcement measures or provisions within the regulations themselves. No individual or trade union has the freestanding right to bring a claim against their employer to compel them to produce these figures. The government has stated that the Equalities and Human Rights Commission will be able to use their existing powers of enforcement, but there's been a lot of dialogue basically doubting whether the Commission has the resources to do this, and actually even the legislative power, just due to the way that the relevant regulations and the Equality Act interact with each other. So in effect the government seems to be relying, and quite overtly so in the ACAS guide actually, seems to be relying on the power of organisations' fear about their brand and their reputation. Potentially there'll be media attention as companies start to roll out their gender pay reports. Potentially most significantly among female recruits, who I do think are most likely to be the section of society that's directly and proactively seeking out these reports and being concerned if they're not there, if they ought to be.
So it's more about sort of public relations and being an employer of choice rather than feeling the full force of the law if employers don't comply or don't fully comply with these regulations.
Yeah, I think that's right, Mark.
So in reality, is there actually going to be any scrutiny over whether employers are complying properly with their obligations, putting in the right figures, or anything else?
Yeah, no, and in effect, it's unlikely that employers are likely, as they're doing all their calculation, to come across all the little niggly issues that we've been speaking about and potentially worry that they're not being entirely in line with the exact prescriptive requirements because of the particular anomalies within their business potentially. But really, it does, because of the lack of enforcement, there is a generally held belief that actually if an employer attempts to take a fair approach and a consistent approach and explains itself in narratives, there's not much that can be done to criticise them for doing that.
Yeah, so if they look like they've published something that makes sense, no one's going to go through their calculations and go, well, you've done that a bit wrong.
Exactly, I think that's exactly right. And the only issues that throws up for us as kind of a society and thinking about gender pay gaps is that potentially it's going to be more difficult to compare one organisation versus another. But no, I don't think any particular organisation is going to suffer any particular, even criticism for doing that.
Mm-hmm. So, Will, are these regulations going to work? Are they going to have the effect that the government desires?
This is the million-dollar question. I think that they could have a very positive effect. I don't know that they're going to eradicate the gender pay gap, because I'm not sure that actually the gender pay gap is going to be down to the actions of those employers with 250 or more employees. I think it's a far bigger societal problem that we're facing, which is to do with a number of issues. Professor Tom Schuller, in his book The Paula Principle, goes into a number of different reasons as to why women don't attain the level that they should within the career structure given their level of education. And he talks about things like, to some extent, it's down to discrimination, and that's something that is being addressed by the Equality Act generally. It doesn't look as though discrimination, as we understand it under the unlawful discrimination, is playing that big a part in the gender pay gap. Difficult to know quite how much, but I think it's generally thought that it's not quite so much that as to do with, as you said in your introduction, things like whether women are choosing to focus on their career, particularly as a result of coming back after childbirth, or whether they are happier to split their focus between family life and business life. And what's interesting is that that's more to do with the gender roles as they are perceived in society, so that men aren't seeming to have that same difficulty in trying to work out what their priorities should be. It seems to be fairly traditional that men aren't really bothered about whether their career is going to be impacted having had children. So women's choice is one thing. I think also that just the sort of structural difficulties of society with who is responsible for childcare afterwards, that is impeding women's ability to forward their career. Also things like self-confidence, that men are more likely to ask for pay rises. Men are more likely to go for promotions, even if they may not tick all of the boxes. There may be sort of 10 things where a man is thinking, right, well, I can do 6 of them, I'll go for it. And a woman will be going down and find that she can do 8, but she won't make the application because she says, well, there's 2 things that I can't do. And that seems to be borne out by the studies that is. It does seem to be just the way things are working on that level. Now, if the gender pay gap reporting can lead to employers trying to address those problems and doing things like encouraging women to come forward for promotions where they feel that they are the right people to be promoted, encouraging the application, then that's going to be all to the good and should start to address the gender pay gap. I think what might happen is that employers will start focusing more on the figures than on the causes, so that they may well be saying, right, well, we can cover this by the spin of the narrative, as opposed to actually working out whether there's anything underneath it. There can be more underhand ways of doing things, like, so for instance, taking people out of the equation completely and spinning them off so the high earners get spun off into a smaller company where they get taken out of the gender pay. If they are the men earning the big bucks at the top of the organisation, they suddenly go into a management company, and that addresses a large part of the gender pay. So it looks as though the gender pay is reducing, but in fact it's not really doing anything to the systemic problems that there may exist otherwise.
So there is scope for employers to kind of massage the figures to make it look like they're doing better than they really are. But on the flip side, an employer with the best will in the world that's willing to take the figures as they are and try and do something about it is not necessarily going to address all the causes of the gender pay gap, because there are greater sort of societal issues at stake.
Yes, exactly. So you can find yourself with an employer who employs 249 blokes and only 1 woman, and that woman is paid reasonably well, and suddenly their gender pay on at least 1 or 2 of the reporting points looks brilliant, because and they all they have to do is put that down. Okay, they'll suffer on the bonus figures, but basically that they can say that that their gender pay gap is very healthy. And yet it doesn't actually reflect the true picture of what's going on. Similarly, also, the way that the narrative can be used, there's not really going to be a huge amount of in-depth analysis, I would say, about that narrative. It'll go out on the website, and maybe that you'll get some media attention, and if the press is particularly keen on investigating a particular company, it might look behind the claims that are being put forward in the narrative. But generally speaking, for instance, from the recruitment point of view, I think people may well be taking that narrative on a fairly face value basis. And so some quite contentious assertions could be made in the narrative, which may be true, but may not give the whole picture.
Yeah.
And I think that's not going to help in terms of whether actually the gender pay disparity is actually getting addressed.
So, Jenny, finally, just to round up this discussion, what can an employer do to try and address its gender pay gap issues?
I'm going to talk about the more systemic, real improvements that can be made rather than the superficial improvements that an employer might decide to implement to improve their own gender pay gap. But that is, for instance, if an employer is worried that actually there are some equal pay issues, equal pay audits, which a lot of larger employers have done over the previous years, and actually addressing women's pay where it needs to be addressed. Looking at the way that organisations structure part-time and flexible work, are they still operating on rigid, traditional corporate structures, or can they implement more remote working and part-time working, and not only for women but for men as well? So part-time working isn't something that's given as a concession to a woman returning from maternity leave, but something that's encouraged generally throughout the workforce population. And looking at the way that part-time and flexible work is paid, and trying to ensure that there isn't an unfair disparity there. considering positive recruitment policies and promotion policies, as Will just discussed, and trying to analyse within an organisation why and when women may be dropping out, and if anything can be done to encourage them to stay, which is ultimately potentially to the great benefit of an employer that's spent years training a woman and then is potentially losing that resource. And lastly, do think about discrimination and particularly unconscious bias, I think, and think about training that can be rolled out to managers and people making the hiring and firing and promotion decisions.
Particularly in relation to bonuses, there's sort of historically been an issue about women getting lower bonuses than men because men are more aggressive negotiators. Exactly.
And so and that's where the gender pay figures may come into their own, because they provide an amalgamated statistical snapshot that, although at times unclear, does help with that transparency piece, because otherwise everybody's operating in effectively a fairly secretive channel. Most people don't discuss their pay, and it's hard for women to even know that there's a potential issue in relation to bonus or pay within an organisation.
Okay. So that concludes our discussion on gender pay gap reporting. We do have lots of materials on the subject on the Practical Law Employment site. We also have a number of blog pieces written by practitioners on our employment blog. You can go to employmentblog.practicallaw.com and search for gender pay gap. So it now only remains for me to thank our speakers, Jenny Barnes and Will Winch. Thank you both very much.
Thank you.